Chapter 6. Tired of Being Famous.
The following week, I wanted to show Mr. Johnson that the spoon had worked, but I had no time. Mrs. Duncan, my neighbor, asked me to clear all the cobwebs out of her attic rafters. The Chapman kids also kept jumping on me every time I stepped outside. In our first game of the season, I scored 73 baskets. That's 146 points, more than one basket each minute of the game. No other player had ever scored that many points in the history of basketball. I got my picture in the Riverside Record the next day. The day after that, the telephone at our house started ringing. Every newspaper, television, and radio station in the country wanted to interview me. I was famous. Every time I left the house, people stopped and stared at me. Mom was just as busy as usual, so I never got to see her. She was always in a hurry, and now I was always hurrying too. Between the interviews, doing jobs for the neighbors, and my homework, I hardly had any time for basketball. I didn't have time to do anything I really enjoyed, like sitting and reading a book or watching television. I didn't even have time to use the computer. I was on my way out the door one morning when the phone rang. "Hello?" I said.
Is this Matthew McDougall?
A broadcaster kind of voice shouted. "Yes," I answered.
Well, this is Mr. Cheeseman. We want you to be our new Cheesy Man athlete.
He said.
A couple of television advertisements, maybe a few magazine photo shoots, several $1 million. What do you say?
"Well, I do love Cheesy Man dinner," I said, "but I'm very busy these days with rescuing cats, helping the Power Corporation repair their lines, and playing basketball. Though I guess I could try being the Cheesy Man athlete." So the next Saturday morning, I went down to the television studio. Mr. Cheeseman was wearing a silly hat shaped like a giant slice of cheese. Just looking at the hat made me feel sick. I kept bumping my head on the ceiling, so we had to shoot the advertisement outside. Everything was going along great until they put a giant bowl of steamy Cheesy Man dinner in front of me. My throat closed up. My stomach churned. I started to feel dizzy. I couldn't do it. I had eaten enough Cheesy Man dinner in those 27 days to last me a lifetime. "I'm sorry, Mr. Cheeseman," I said. "I don't think I can do this. I'm feeling rather sick." Mr. Cheeseman stopped smiling. He walked over to the table, picked up my multi-million-dollar contract, and ripped it into tiny pieces. "I'm sorry," I repeated. He walked back into the office and slammed the door behind him. As I lay on the back porch that night trying to sleep, I thought about my life before the magnifying spoon. Sure, I wasn't the tallest basketball player in the world, or even the tallest on our team. However, I had lots of free time to play with my friends. My clothes all fit me, and people didn't stare at me. I also had time to read to the elderly people at RRR. I remembered Mr. Johnson and felt guilty that I hadn't had time to see him in a very long time. The next day, I went back to visit Mr. Johnson. I could not fit into his room, so I had to talk to him through the window. He was no longer a giant. He had shrunk, and his feet were small and no longer hairy. He was standing and looking at me, and I was the giant.
You look good, Matthew McDougall,
he said.
Big and strong.
I guess the magnifying spoon worked for me too, I answered. He nodded and looked me up and down. Before I could say anything, he said,
Had enough of being a superstar, Matthew McDougal?
I guess I didn't look too happy. Well, it's just, I didn't know it would take up so much time being a super tall person, I explained. Is there any way to reverse the magic? Should I give the spoon back? Mr. Johnson chuckled and shook his head.
That's not possible. It always has to be passed on to another person, a younger person. That's how the magic was reversed for me.
You sure have shrunk, sir, I said, but I don't think I want to give the spoon up. Not yet. Mr. Johnson stood up.
I rather like being a normal size again.
He paused for a moment and then said,
There is another way you can return to a normal size without giving away the spoon.
There is? I said, I'll do anything.
What food do you think is the exact opposite of Cheesy Man dinner?
He asked. I thought about it for a minute. I tried to think of the most tasteless thing I had ever eaten. Lima beans, I said. They're not salty, they're mushy, and they taste like cardboard. Mr. Johnson's blue eyes sparkled.
Well then, you must eat nothing other than lima beans for 27 days, and always use the magic spoon upside down.
My mouth dropped open. Upside down? I stared at him. Lima beans? Isn't there another choice? He shook his head.
It's either the lima beans or being a giant. That's your choice.